right, welcome. I'm Zoe Trott. I'm a professor in the American and Canadian Studies Department here at Nottingham. I'm co-director of the Centre for Research in Race and Rights. Just want to welcome you actually on behalf of the Department of American and Canadian Studies. This is our American Studies annual lecture. So this is the event each year where we invite a world-leading figure to come and share their knowledge in our field of American studies, so American history and literature and visual culture and film, sociology, politics, music, and the interdisciplinary study of all of these things. And so, as Europe's largest American Studies department, it's a chance for us to share just some of what we do with you by hosting a talk like this. And of course, much of what we do is transnational. It's about those transatlantic crossings and influences. It's about America's place in the world. It's about the borders with Canada and Mexico. It's about the global history of the black diaspora and the relevance of, America's traumas and triumphs and traditions to us here in the UK. And there's no one better to reflect that focus than Professor Glenda Carpio. Her research spans the Americas. It challenges what we think we know about American immigrant culture and history and literature. It looks at experiments with Dominican Spanish and Latino Spanish and African American expression. It examines American expats in Europe and much, much more, always with that eye, though, on the hemispheric, the transnational, the borders, the tensions, the fusions of America's many cultural identities. She is Professor of African and African American Studies and English at Harvard University. She's been named one of the Roots 100 top African American achievers and influencers. She's received Harvard's University Prize for Excellence and Sensitivity in Undergraduate Teaching. And among her many publications is the book Laughing Fit to Kill, Black Humor in the Fictions of Slavery. It's just by far the best book that exists on the tradition in which black American humorists from 19th century to today use satire and hyperbole and obscenity and burlesque to represent a violent history and to take on issues of racial injustice. And she's currently working on a book about immigration and expatriation and exile, which is what she's going to talk to us about tonight. So we have tonight really one of the world's leading experts on black and minority ethnic literature and culture. And it's also a great pleasure to welcome Glenda because I'm lucky enough to call her my friend. I got to know her during the 11 years that I spent in the US until just recently. 8 of those were at Harvard. I was a postgraduate student. I took classes with Glenda, got to know her first as just a hugely gifted teacher, and then as an advisor when she agreed very kindly to be on my PhD dissertation committee. So I've been hoping just ever since I moved back to the US to the UK 3 years ago, that we might find a chance to host her here at Nottingham, just so you can all see why her Harvard students love her so much, why her colleagues love her. So I'm just grateful that she agreed to come. Glad on behalf of us that we can welcome her tonight, that we can hear about her research and ask her questions at the end of her talk and have a conversation. So please join me in welcoming Professor Glenda Carpio.
Thanks, Zoe, and thank you everyone for coming. It's my pleasure to be here, and I'm very pleased to have been invited to share with you some of my research. I am going to begin by sharing 3 instances where immigration and exile intersect in American culture. One is, though the title is in Today's America, or Contemporary America, I want to actually begin with one historical instance, one fictional, and one contemporary, where these instances will help me lay out some of the issues that I bring to you for contemplation, for consideration, and for discussion. So the first one, what you're looking at is a photograph of the Mexican-U.S. border. And so some of the images that I have very few images, but just to think about as you're listening to this one, the first instance is from 1908. And this is more of a contemporary image, and to think about some of the connections across time in immigrant narratives and immigrant culture. Also, how the particular angle and particular choices in the way of representing the border in this particular photograph. So my first instance is the story of Lazarus Averbach, a young man who survived the 1903 Kishinev pogrom in what's now Moldova, only to be killed and shot by a Chicago policeman on suspicions of anarchist activity shortly after his arrival in the United States. So this is how the story goes. Early in the morning of March 2nd, 1908, Lazarus, his name, this Lazarus, right? He might have been Harry or Jeremiah, though history calls him Lazarus. He took a streetcar away from the overcrowded tenements where he lived in Chicago towards a very posh neighborhood of the north side, and headed to Lincoln Place, a short street lined by tall brick houses, pocked with windows and protected by wrought iron fences. At 8 a.m., Averbach walked up to the house, to one of these houses, and rang the bell. A maid answered, gave him a disdainful look over because he was very poorly dressed, very skinny, and told him to come back an hour later. An hour passed. Averbach returned and was admitted into the home of George Shippey, Chicago's chief of police. Almost immediately, the sound of gunfire erupted. At least 6 shots were fired, and when the smoke cleared, Lazarus, just a few weeks shy of his 19th birthday, lay dying, his body riddled with bullets. Also wounded were Harry Shippey, the chief's son, and James Foley, the driver. As for Chief Shippey, he had only a slight knife wound under his right arm, or perhaps he never suffered an injury at all, because as you'll see later, the account of what happened in those short moments is very contested. For 2 or 3 weeks, the news of Averbach's death preoccupied Chicago, and then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the story vanished and was gradually forgotten. During those brief weeks, however, the press focused intensely on the story. The Chicago's Tribune had this account of what happened. According to this newspaper, Averbach was armed and intended to kill the chief of police. In self-protection, then, the chief pulled out his own revolver and shot the man in the neck. The chief's son was purportedly shot in the chest by the intruder, while his driver exchanged shots with this foreigner. Enraged, the chief fired 2 more shots at the intruder, this time with deadly effect, as the Tribune put it. After less than 3 minutes, the confrontation was over. But what was Lazarus doing at the chief of police's house, and what evidence was there that he was trying to kill him? The answers that circulated in most of the local papers was that the young Lazarus was an anarchist assassin, and that he had gone to the chief of police houses to play out his political identity. In a city that vividly recalled the violent Haymarket incident, which is in 1886, a labor rally culminated with the deaths of 8 policemen and several citizens. The anarchist label raised the specter of a vast foreign-born conspiracy intent on toppling law and order across the country. The police fed this fear. It exposed Lazarus's corpse to the public because his violent nature was supposed to be manifest in his face and the shape of his head. The public marveled over his low forehead, large mouth, and simian ears. This is one taken from the archives. They were all presumably markers of anarchist proclivities. After a rush autopsy that was made to support Shippey's version of what happened, Lazarus' body was hastily buried in a potter's field. 2 days after Averbach's shooting, Emma Golden, known as the Red Queen, arrived in Chicago, igniting a wave of editorials that called for deportations, limits on free speech, and increased surveillance. Does any of this sound familiar? Hectored by police, Goldman never went into hiding and never had an opportunity to address her Chicago followers in the wake of the shooting. But gradually, people began to voice the suspicions that they had silently harbored about this incident. But where was the evidence that Averbach was an anarchist? Other than a few books among his meager belongings, there was none. Contrary to early reports, evidence pointed that it was unlikely that he had ever attended the March of the Unemployed, which was part of the evidence that people used to say he was an anarchist, because he was actually gainfully employed. He worked as an egg packer on South Water Street, where he earned high praise from his boss. But already a movement was afoot to gather funds to aid his sister, a seamstress in a Chicago sweatshop, and like her brother, a survivor of the vicious Kishivet pogrom. Olga Averbach had been detained by the police for 72 hours and subjected to relentless interrogation. Convinced of her brother's innocence and desperately trying to reclaim his body and provide him with a Jewish burial, she found herself taken under the wing of the city's great champion of immigrant rights. I'm talking about Jane Addams. From her base in Hull House, Addams raised money for Olga's case and set out to find a lawyer to represent her. She was rebuffed by Chicago's top legal minds and finally turned to Harold LeClaire Ickes, who would later win fame as a champion of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. He had only just begun to practice law, and this would be his first case. He began by orchestrating a second autopsy by a doctor of his choice, which of course required the exhuming of Averbach's body, hence the very wearily poetic weight of his purportedly first name, Lazarus. The second autopsy revealed several interesting facts. Ickes' doctor discovered that another fatal wound had entered Averbach. That shot had been sent from the back. That it had taken him from the back, and this ran, contrary to reports that Chief Shippey had made before. Further, an undertaker who was in the room, noting how one bullet had entered and exited the body, concluded that the young man had also been shot at least once from above. But the most curious detail would emerge only years later, after Ickes committed it to an unpublished memoir. Noticing a heated dispute between an attendant and the country coroner, Ickes asked someone about the reason for the argument. It turned out that in violation of both civil and Jewish law, the coroner had removed Averbach's brain and sent it off for examination. For the time being, Ickes kept this fact to himself. But on March 24th, when the country coroner convened and predictably exonerated Shippey and his driver, Foley, of Lazarus's murder, Ickes revealed to the coroner his knowledge that Lazarus's brain had been removed. Purportedly, this was done to better examine the mind of an anarchist. Ickes used this knowledge to clear Averbach of the charge of anarchism. When Ickes confronted the coroner, he agreed there would be no talk of anarchy, and also admitted that the police had no evidence to link Averbach to the anarchist movement. The coroner's concession was Ickes' one small victory on behalf of Olga Averbach and her dead brother. Before the year was out, Olga returned to her family, who was settled in Chernovitz. Today, the city is called Chernovitz and is part of the Ukraine. She sent at least one letter from Europe to Ickes, begging him to establish her brother's innocence beyond the court case. Her letter tears her heart out, says Walter Roth, who co-authored a book called An Accidental Anarchist, which tells the story of Lazarus in full. Walter Roth and his co-author, whose name I'm blanking on right now, did some research on what happened to Olga when she returned to East Europe. And they found out that, they didn't find much, but they found out that the likelihood is that she died when the Nazis took over that part of Europe in 1941. So that's my first very cheerful story. The second one comes from a novel. It's fictional. It comes from Dina Mengetsu's 2007 novel, The Beautiful Things That Heaven Bears. This novel focuses on Sefa Stefanos, a young man who is exiled from Ethiopia after witnessing the murder of his father during the country's Red Terror, which happened between 1977 and 1978 and killed up to 500,000 people. At the time of the novel's opening, it has been 17 years since Sefa fled Addis Ababa for Washington, D.C., in which time he has become the owner of a struggling grocery store in Logan Circle, a neighborhood until quite recently inhabited only by the poor and the dark, but beginning to be gentrified. Rather than detail the process of Sefa's Americanization, Mengetsu poignantly renders how haunted Sefa remains, how unable he is to separate his new life from the memories of his father's tragic end, partly because when you read the novel, you see that he feels culpable for this death. Quote, "In those days, I believe it was only a matter of weeks or months before I returned home to Ethiopia," Sefa writes. Adding, "How was I supposed to live in America when I had never really left Ethiopia?" As critic Rob Nixon puts it, the novel is about the animate presence of loss, about a man struggling to find traction in his ostensibly current life. The deeply felt pain in Mengetsu's novel, Nixon adds, is offset by the solace of friendship, whether it's a friendship that hovers on the verge of romance, a friendship between an adult and a child, or above all, the friendships that steady the daily lives of fellow immigrants. And indeed, the novel opens by introducing Sefa and his intimate friends, Joseph from the Congo and Kenneth from Kenya, whom he first meets at a hotel where they work as bellhops. Sefa and his friends are unlike African immigrants of the 1960s and 1970s, whose primary objective was to obtain an American education before returning home to contribute to the task of nation building. Instead, Sefa and his friends are part of the more recent wave of African immigrants, who are mainly refugees and asylum seekers, escaping the ravages of civil wars and political persecutions in their homelands. In The Beautiful Things That Heaven Bears, Mengetsu makes use of a rich array of literary references to represent the inextricability of exile and immigration. A reference to V.S. Naipaul's A Bend in the River, published in 1979, which is about an Indian Muslim, also a shopkeeper, trying to make a life in Africa, swiftly invokes the pain of Sefa's exile, of his suspended and stagnant life between his tragic past and his inert present, between Africa and America. Sefa, who reads a book every 2 days while he takes care of his struggling grocery store, finds refuge in fiction. He reads Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, meditating on the political persecution that Dostoevsky suffered. The title of Mengetsu's novel comes from Dante's exit from the Inferno, and thus implicitly invokes Dante's own exile from Florence due to his political activities. Dante wrote the Divine Comedy as a virtual wanderer, seeking protection for his family in town after town. The Beautiful Things That Heaven Bears is also a line not only the title of the novel, in a title from Dante's Inferno, but a line that comes in the middle of the novel. There it points to the pain suffered by Africans at the hands of various dictators. Hell every day with only glimpses of heaven in between, says Sefa's friend Joseph. And it also points to the hope of deliverance. In a carefully measured and subtle style, Mengetsu brings alive the humor and camaraderie of immigrants in the sanctuary of their own company. At the store after hours, Sefa and his friends play a memory game in front of an old tattered map of Africa. The game is called Name a Dictator and Guess the Year and Country. Quote, "We've been playing the game for over a year," writes Sefa, noting that the group expands the game to include failed coups, rebellions, minor insurrections, guerrilla leaders, and the acronym of as many rebel groups as we can find. There are always more, the names, dates, and years multiplying as fast as we can memorize them, so that at times we wonder half-jokingly if perhaps we ourselves are somewhat responsible. If to name is to create, then the group's name may not be as passive, game may not be as passive as it seems. Does their exile and inaction make them somehow complicit with the brutalities they have escaped? The group creatively responds to the pain of history by highlighting absurdity. Referring to the various dictators they name, Sefa writes, quote, "We have our favorites, Bukasa, Amin, Mobutu. We love the ones known for their absurd declarations and comical performances, the dictators who marry 40 women and have twice as many children, who sit on golden thrones shaped like eagles, declare themselves minor gods, and are surrounded by rumors of incest, cannibalism, sorcery, magic." Underlying the humor the men share in their observations is their deeply felt pathos, which Mengetsu renders in an understated style that sometimes burst into direct, bold expression. Quote, "I did not come to America to find a better life," Sefa writes. "I came here running and screaming with the ghost of an old one firmly attached to my back." That's the second story I have to share with you. The second one, the third and last one, is really not a case or story. It's an account of a crisis, which is known as the Child Immigrant Crisis of 2014. Its setting, it's right where this picture was taken, the U.S.-Mexican border, where tens of thousands of unaccompanied children have crossed the border seeking asylum. Most of the children come from Guatemala, where I was born, Honduras, or El Salvador. Thus, many of them have crossed the entire length of Mexico to get to the U.S. border. A number of them have arrived in desperate shape. Nobody knows how many more started north and never arrived. Some of the survivors say that they fled violence, often related to gang and drug cartel violence. Mexican children report that they are persecuted by groups trying to recruit them into the human smuggling trafficking that has flourished in the border. Apparently the fact that they're children makes them, if they get caught, they probably won't be punished, and so on and so forth. They also don't know their rights, so they can be made to do a number of things. Other children have crossed searching for relatives. Some were told lies by the traffickers seeking their relatives' money. They were told that the United States will not deport them, which is patently untrue. The Border Patrol, local shelters, and the Department of Health and Human Services, the agency to which unaccompanied minors must, by law, be entrusted, were reportedly overwhelmed. Detention centers in the state of Texas overflowed, prompting the Federal Department of Homeland Security to open emergency shelters. The political response has been in many ways appalling. Rick Perry, who was the governor of Texas, ordered 1,000 National Guard troops to defend the border from these children. The Obama administration created a priority juvenile docket in immigration courts to speed up deportation proceedings. Vice President Biden and Secretary of State John Kerry met with leaders of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador to offer $10 million in new aid to Central American governments to help with repatriating their children. Meanwhile, Representative Randy Weber, a freshman Republican from Texas, introduced legislation to cut off all aid to Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador as punishment. 1 year later, 2015, the number of children arriving at the border has sharply decreased, in part because Mexico has been returning children to their home countries before they can reach the United States. But the crisis has not abated. It has simply shifted to courtrooms, which are now filled with young defendants who have done nothing, but lacking lawyers and judges to handle the sheer volume of cases. Thousands of children without lawyers have been issued deportation orders, some because they never showed up in court. As a young immigrant lawyer put it, quote, "Children who appear in immigrant court by themselves have about a 7% chance of successful outcome. If they're represented by counsel, they have about a 70% chance." Wendy Young, the president of Kids in Need of Defense, a national legal advocacy group, has argued that, quote, "The situation last summer was characterized as part of the overall immigration system being broken and is taking us down the wrong policy path. This is not an immigration crisis. It's a refugee crisis." But children that came to the United States to escape violence rarely qualify as refugees. Children aren't an ethnic group, and gangs aren't granted the same recognition as invading armies. While the crisis received media attention last year, that has since abated, it rarely includes the perspective of the children themselves. A recent article in the Atlantic Monthly is an exception. It focuses on the life of one child, Guillermo. We don't know his last name for people trying to protect him, who fled El Salvador to escape gang violence and recruitment. Based on an extended interview, the article recounts how Guillermo was caught in a warfare between two major international gangs, the MS-13 and Barrio 18. This is how the article begins. One night last winter, Guillermo, then 15, walked outside with friends as it rained. he heard a car's tires slowing as it splashed in puddles until it stopped beside him. A Barrio 18 gangster fired from the window. Guillermo ducked behind a parked truck. His friend leaped into a cardboard box. Guillermo and his friends were fine, but a young father who had stepped outside to make a call was shot in the stomach. The father ran across the street to a nearby hospital, but he died the next day. By that time, the gangs had already shot Guillermo's father in the chest. They forced his brother-in-law to his knees and shot him in the head. Both had survived, miraculously, though his father had lost a lung, and for a year his brother-in-law carried a bullet in his skull. At night, Guillermo saw the rising body count on the news. At school, he heard from friends of how the gangs tried to recruit them. At the dirt field where Guillermo played soccer, he was told that gangsters had broken into women's nearby homes and raped them with a broomstick and then murdered them. Soon after, gangs began trying to recruit Guillermo, threatening to kill him if he did not join. On July 1st, 2014, Guillermo fled El Salvador, almost 2,000 miles, and a week later, he floated across the Rio Grande on an inflatable raft. Critics of the idea that children like Guillermo should be given asylum argue that high murder rates and gang violence is no basis for political asylum. But the gangs responsible for the violence began during the Cold War. In El Salvador's 12-year civil war, the United States backed a violent military dictatorship. In one of many instances of the violence it practiced, it killed mourners at a funeral of a Catholic archbishop, 800 of them in a single massacre. Guerrilla groups backed by communist countries have retaliated against the state, and this has created the 12-year civil war. The conflict has produced thousands of innocent deaths and high numbers of migrants. Many of those who fled traveled north to Los Angeles, which at the time was embroiled in its own type of war related to gangs and drugs. Gang violence in Los Angeles reached its height in 1990, right where I went to teach there in 1991 through the Teach for America program. I taught in Compton. Quite an experience. Salvador teens who'd settled there lived in poor neighborhoods surrounded by well-established black and Latino gangs. Some of those Salvadorians started their own gang called the MSS. M for Mara, which is another name for Salvadorians. S for Salvatrucha, again for Salvadorians, and the other S for stoners because they like to smoke pot. MSS had formed in the same territory as a much older and larger Latino gang called Barrio 18 after 18th Street that accepted mostly Latino recruits from any country. Barrio 18 saw this new Salvadorian gang as a threat to its dominance, so to defend itself, it grew its ranks. MSS turned violent. They learned to extort, push drugs, and murder. They dropped the S that stood for stoner and added 13, possibly because M is the 13th letter of the alphabet. As its rivalry with MS-13 intensified, Barrio 18 also recruited Salvadorian teens, and Los Angeles packed its prisons full of gangsters from both sides. During the Clinton presidency, the government deported thousands of them back to Central America. Many times, the government did so without informing the receiving country. So in a war-worried country about the size and population of Massachusetts, and living under a truce that allowed war criminals on both sides to serve openly in government, the United States had dropped thousands of prison-trained Los Angeles hardened Barrio 18 MS-13 gangsters. El Salvador had gangs before, but they were mostly men aligned by neighborhood and formed groups that are no comparison to the gangs of today. They were small, disorganized, and lacked weapons. When Barrio 18 and Barrio 13 gangsters were deported and arrived in El Salvador, they, as one article put it, they were treated like royalty, like celebrities. They brought concepts of territory, drug and gun smuggling, extortion, and drive-by shootings. As the Atlantic Monthly article puts it, El Salvador was desperate to stop the rising crime and murders. So in the early 2000, it jailed M13 and Barrio 18 members for any reason it could, often just because of their tattoos. The government called the approach mano dura, or firm hand. The gangs retaliated by killing police. In 2012, the government and the Roman Catholic Church helped broker a truce between the two gangs. It caused a dramatic drop in murder, but the truce didn't last. In 2014, murders climbed again and are now on pace to make El Salvador one of the deadliest countries in the world. Allow me to return to Guillermo's story. At first, his father sent him away to live in another city with one of his grandmothers. But the gangs followed him there. A former gang unit cop said that he knows of cases where an M13 gang member in California and another one in the East Coast of the United States have conference calls with a gangster in El Salvador. So it's really very much possible for someone to follow a potential recruit. In fact, Guillermo, through a friend, Guillermo's father learned that the gang had sent word to murder his son. To save Guillermo, his father sent him to Virginia, where Guillermo's mother had already fled. And like thousands, Guillermo made the long and dangerous trip across the two countries, Guatemala and Mexico, to then cross the U.S. border, where human smuggling, targeting children like Guillermo, has been flourishing. Often, people at the border will kidnap children and then contact their parents in the United States and extort money from them, right? And if the parents in the United States are undocumented, they can't go to the police to reveal that there's an extortion case, so there's a big bind. Each country has reasons. El Salvador has mainly gang-related reasons, and children fleeing from Guatemala have slightly different reasons. There, the conflict is between most of them have indigenous backgrounds, and so you have to follow the particular history of Guatemala and indigenous cultures there, and also Guatemala's intense and very intimate relationship to the CIA. Guatemala and Iran were the first two countries that the CIA basically invaded and where they put puppet governments on. Right? So the history of Guatemala and the current conditions of violence and neglect with children, it's very much embroiled in a very long and very shadowy history of U.S. neocolonialism there. So we know that the child immigrant crisis is something not particular to this border, right? What you have here is the map of the path that youth had to take out of Syria to make it to Sweden. Okay, if you read the narrative from where this was taken, right, he makes it out and then with a fake Italian passport at the border. This is in the current New Yorker. At the border, they bring him someone who speaks Italian. He can speak a lick of Italian, so he gets sent back. He's a law student, so he gets mocked for breaking the law. His story is very similar to Guillermo's, right? And the path that he has to take to make it out is incredibly convoluted. Okay. So now I've told you three stories: Lazarus Averbach, Cefa Stefanos, and Guillermo. And in the following, I've tried to make some connections here. Okay. I've presented you with three instances where immigration and exile intersect. And they each highlight how the terms usually understood as distinct, refugee, immigrant, exile, or, if you like, a more sort of class-based invocations of this, the émigré, right, as opposed to the refugee, the immigrant, as opposed to, a cosmopolitan subject, right? So all these categories, they intertwine in ways that are not always accounted for. This, as we know, is not particular to the States, but in the American context, it has to do with a founding myth about that country. The mythology of immigrants in the United States suggests that immigrants seek America looking for a better livelihood, that the impetus for migration is mostly economic, and it is, indeed, it often is. But the historical and contemporary reality of immigration also hides the fact that the dream of the golden land has always been intimately intertwined with histories of persecution and exile due to either political instability or religious persecution. The Puritans were fleeing religious persecution. In the latter half of the 20th century, often violence in home countries is connected to American neocolonial and Cold War practices. As Sakavan Berkovich and other American studies scholars have revealed, a topology established from the Puritans onwards that includes images of exodus and deliverance to a promised land, as well as Lazarus-like transformations through death and rebirth, produced a myth about the United States as a land of deliverance. So Lazarus Averbach, right, that name, his story illustrates that reality is often otherwise, and so does the child immigrant refugee crisis. The corpus of immigrant writing, in fact, catalogs varieties of laws, including that of language, of family, of community, of religious affiliation, of geographical context, of a sense of social belonging, of the rights afforded by citizenship, and so on. It also represents the thread or actuality of spiritual and even physical death. Two particularly striking examples: Pietro di Donato's Christ in Concrete, published in 1939, narrates the deaths of immigrant construction workers who died trying to survive the economic hardships of acculturation. There's also old Rollwag's Giants in the Earth, 1927, which tells the story of a Norwegian pioneer family struggles as immigrants and settlers in Dakota, where they experience extreme poverty and loneliness. One particularly striking image is that of the father of the family who dies frozen to death in a Fargo-like landscape, looking towards the ever-receding West Coast. Not surprisingly, this aspect of immigration has been de-emphasized in favor of more transcendent narrative trajectories, especially those concerning successful assimilation, since it taps into the rags to riches Horatio Alger path, the rugged individualism of the American character, right? It taps into the idea of acculturation, which, assimilation is a kind of melting pot theory, rather you melt into, right? Acculturation gives you a sense of hyphenated identities that don't lose their home origin, but are able to do a kind of in-between, right? This has been done in the name of hybridity, celebrating hybridity. Some of the best-known immigrant texts, such as Mary Anting's 1912 autobiography, The Promised Land, and we had a little bit brief discussion of that text today, represents the intersection of immigration and exile. For like many Jewish immigrants, Antin and her family left for America not only because of economic need, but also because they were marginalized and economically subjugated due to their faith. But Antin does so within a progressively conceived trajectory of assimilation and transformance. Opening lines of her text, quote, "I was born, I have lived, and I have been made over. I am just as much out of the way as if I were dead, for I am absolutely other than the person whose story I have to tell." As the title of her text indicates, Antin represents her transformation from Polish immigrant to American citizen through the typology of exodus and deliverance to a promised land to which I referred. But for Antin, the purpose of declaring the total loss of self to the world in the name of immigration was political. As Werner Solos argues, Antin sought, quote, to offset a growing sense of American nativist hostility to immigration by presenting the inwardness of a consciousness that underwent the transformation from foreign immigrant to American citizen successfully. Thus, this political move to accentuate assimilation. But underlying this narrative of utter loss and complete transformation is a more ambivalent and ambiguous story of a self caught between worlds, of an author exploring the fragmentation of, rather than the loss of a self through rebirth. If Anton, like many other immigrant writers, emphasized assimilation as a positive result of our displacement due to the economic needs and faith-based persecution, with the multicultural turn of the late 20th century, immigrant writers emphasized acculturation, the mixing of cultural identities, rather than espouse a melting pot view of American culture, which, even from its inception, it was popularized by a play called The Melting Pot, right, in the early 20th century. This idea has had criticism. Take, for instance, Randolph Bourne's 1916 essay, Transnational America, in which he argued for a new, more cosmopolitan conception of American culture. Influenced by the African American civil rights and Black Powers movements, immigrant writers made strong cases for cultural pride, emphasizing survival and agency in their accounts of immigrant life in America. With this emphasis also came an intense focus on matters of identity and on the experience of misalignment, disorientation, placelessness within and across groups. In the contemporary period, however, a new crop of immigrant writers, including but not limited to Junot Diaz, Chimamanda Adichie, Garish Stangard, Teju Cole, and the already noted Dina Mengetsu, Alexander Hemon, of which I'll have more to say, among others, are moving away from both the assimilationist and the acculturation models towards a more cosmopolitan view of immigration, one that places much more emphasis on the social and political lives of immigrants before they arrive in the United States. Some of these writers, in particular Diaz, Cole, Mengetsu, and Hemon, take into account the status of immigrants as refugees and exiles. This new crop of writers have risen in the context of significant shifts in global migration in the latter half of the 20th century, as well as in American immigrant policy. And this to give you a wide lens angle that I should have probably given you at the start, but I'll do so now. So the first wave of the first major period of immigration to the United States in the conventional sense of the term, that is, if we don't consider the forced migration of Africans or the settler colonial European experience, began in the late 1840s and came to a climax in the 1880s, when the number of immigrants was more than 5 million. The majority of these immigrants leaving because of famines, social upheavals, came from the most part from the United Kingdom, from Germany, from Ireland, and Scandinavia. In the first quarter of the 20th century, immigration to the United States reached a high peak, with 17 million people, mostly Italian, Polish, and Central and Eastern European of Jewish faith, entering the country. Henry Roth's beautiful book called Sleep invokes 1907, which is the moment of the highest peak of the second wave of immigration. This last wave ended in the 1920s when America set in place legislative restrictions aimed at stemming the flow of immigrants. But since the 1965 Hart-Celler Immigration Act, which abolished national quotas, that system that was put in place by the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924, more than 20 million immigrants have entered the United States, half of which arrived during the 1980s. Mostly from countries in Asia and Latin America. In fact, from 1980 to 1993, European immigrants were only 13% of the 20 million immigrants that have entered the country, whereas those from Asia were 39%, and those from Latin America, including the Caribbean, were 43%. A growing number of immigrants are also arriving from Africa. According to figures from the Immigration and Naturalization Services, the INS, the number of African immigrants to the United States more than quadrupled in the last 2 decades of the 20th century. Between 1960 and 2007, the number of immigrants to the United States grew from 35,000 to approximately 1.4 million. Most of this growth has taken place since 1990. The new literature on immigration, therefore, overwhelmingly deals with the experience of people who are not from Europe or of European descent. Race is a significant topic in this new literature. As various critics have noted, American history no doubt shows that the racial category of white is contingent and evolving, so that at various points in American history, the whiteness of the Irish or of Jewish people was a matter of contestation. Nevertheless, it is safe to say that race is an altogether more complicated and important issue in the new literature of immigration. Immigrants from the Caribbean and other countries of Latin America, where the slave trade had significant impact, challenge American racial categories, since their racial identity is neither black nor white, at least not in the ways that Americans have historically defined these terms. Junot Díaz's debut collection of short stories, Drown, and his novel, The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, blurred the categories immigrant and exile, while presenting a challenge to traditional views of Americanization. The stories in Drown shuttle between the Dominican Republic and the United States, more specifically New Jersey, actually, and revolve around family dramas intensified by the losses of immigrant uprooting, poverty in American ghettos, the drugs that infest them, and the lack of opportunity and depression suffered by its inhabitants. This is hardly a narrative about arriving to the Promised Land. The focus on the stories is thus not on the trials and tribulations of immigrants gaining a better life in America. Rather, the stories emphasize the connections between life in the country of origin in the United States, where immigrants face a number of hardships that are not easily, if ever, surmounted, especially since crises in economic and political power have weakened the promise that America once represented. Nonetheless, these stories, like much recent immigrant fiction, highlight the fact that, despite economic, legal, and racial oppression that limit their mobility, immigrants are no longer forced to make choices about conforming to their new home without contact with the land of origin, and they are somewhat freed from the expectations and external pressures to conflate identity with nation. Part of this development has to do with technological innovation and travel in the early 19th century. It took weeks and weeks to cross the Atlantic. But as Díaz, the Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde shows, the increasingly intertwined relationship between country of origin and new home is also due to the history of neocolonialism, a history that also produces a blurring between the category immigrant and exile. Told from the perspective of Junior, a character from Drown, Díaz's novel focuses on the lives of two first-generation Americans, Lola, Junior's one-time girlfriend, and her younger brother, Oscar, but traces their origins to the Dominican Republic through their mother's narrative, which Díaz places at the core of the novel. The story of his mother, Hipatia Delicia Cabral, quote, which he describes as a girl so dark it was as if the creatrix had, in her making, blinked, entails surviving a brutal beating in a cane field at a time of the Trujillo dictatorship and her subsequent exile to the United States. Orchestrated by the dictator's sister, the beating is in part personal revenge, but it is also evidence of the extreme racism suffered by black people under Trujillo. Díaz is a novelist who is firmly rooted in the specificities of Dominican history. Yet, far from focusing myopically on the topic, he expertly shows the ways in which the African diaspora, U.S. imperialism, and the exodus of Dominicans to the U.S., caused largely by the U.S.-backed dictatorship of Trujillo, are all interrelated. The many footnotes that accompany his novel serve as a principal lens into Dominican history, specifically to the history of Rafael Leonidas Trujillo Molina, whom he calls the, quote, pig-eyed mulatto who bleached his skin and who ruled the Dominican Republic in a dictatorship that lasted between 1930 and 1961. Díaz writes, he treated the country like it was his plantation, and he was the master. At its conclusion, the novel circles back to the Dominican Republic, where Oscar is murdered in a beating similar to the one his mother survived. The novel thus traces not only the factors that result in exile for one generation, but also challenges transcendent narratives of acculturation. Díaz's novel shares much with Alexander Heeman's 2008 novel, The Lazarus Project, which is based on the story of the historical figure of Lazarus Averbach, which I told you about at the beginning. The novel, which is narrated by Vladimir Brick, a Bosnian immigrant who writes Lazarus' story, and in the process of doing so decides to return to Sarajevo, not only alternates between the story of Lazarus' short life in America in 1908 with that of Brick's roughly 100 years later, which is when the book is published, but also includes photographs placed at the beginning of each section, some taken from the Chicago Historical Society and others taken by Brick's friend, Rora, who accompanies him to Eastern Europe to retrace Lazarus' footsteps. This is one of the images that the novel includes, is the novel of Lazarus. This is, Lazarus is dead in this photograph. And in the larger photographs, you actually see him sitting, and he looks eerily alive. Right? Heyman notes that his interest in Averbach was not a historian's, but his novel did bring Lazarus' story out of relative obscurity. It also suggests analogies between the 1908 fear of anarchism and the xenophobia that accompanied the huge wave of immigration of 1907 and the persecution of immigrants and other vulnerable subjects in 2008 as a result of the war on terror. The most direct connection is arguably not actually, there's no immigrants, contemporary immigrants being persecuted in the novel, but the connection is much more between these photographs of Lazarus' corpse and the photographs of prisoners in Abu Ghraib, right? This is what Heyman has said, right? And the point of connection is that this photograph makes an exhibition out of a murder committed in the name of a twisted patriotism turned criminal. The story of Lazarus Averbach and its historical version, as well as in the 2008 fictional rendition, are thus connected to the second story I shared with you, that of Stefanos, from Dina Mengetsu's novel, 2007 novel, for they both feature a trend in American immigrant fiction, a trend that challenges the conventions of narrating the displacement of immigration. First is the status of immigrants as exiles and refugees is emphasized within a cosmopolitan view of immigration to America. There's also the fact that the primary place of autobiography, particularly the Bildungsroman, which focuses so much on assimilation and acculturation, on hyphenated identities, is now giving way to narratives that are far more aesthetically innovative and that focus on both the political status of immigrants in their country of origin and on their lives in America. So in many ways, the focus shifts away from thinking about what America means, what belonging in America means, to what American politics have done in other countries, right? And the connection between immigration and exile via that set of policies. With my account of the child refugees crisis, I wanted to bring to your attention the need for this kind of fiction. What I mean by this is that it should include, of course, the testimonial account by the children themselves. And here's a picture that the Atlantic Monthly includes of Guillermo sitting right there. Right? It should include the testimony of children, right? But I also want to argue that it should include the more experimental fiction of which Heyman's The Lazarus Project and Mengetsu's The Beautiful Things That Heaven Bears are examples. For this kind of fiction allows us to meditate not only on stories of individuals, on the personal and autobiographical in their lives in America, but also on the aggregate experience and their relationship to global migration due to persecution, war, transnationally produced forms of violence. Right? There's a movement away from identity, from the testimonial, although I'm not claiming that is not necessary. We need both. Right? This is a picture taken from the Washington Post that it's an article that allows you to see each of these faces of some of those thousands of immigrant refugee children, right? And the story allows you to see the reasons why they fled. They're different, right? They have as common denominator the fact that they are children, that they are vulnerable, and that there's the kind of the policy that America has to contend with them is all over the place, and that even the way that we narrate their stories is also all over the place, but not in the places that we need. And so one hopes that someone like Junot Diaz will write a story about one of them, all of that, as an aggregate. Thank you for listening.
I have a load of different questions, but I want to throw it over to you and invite questions for Glenda.
Thank you so much for that wonderful paper, very thought-provoking. I just wanted to put on a tiny thing you mentioned in policy, when you were talking about assimilations, and you mentioned loss of language, one of the things that can be lost. And I suppose I wanted to ask you briefly about the role of language, whether it is in terms of making it more difficult, say, for children who are unrepresented to make their case, but also in terms of fragmented identities or healing narratives, if you like, whether you think sort of a keeping of a language can actually be a positive thing. Traditionally we think of America as not very hospitable to languages, but I wondered if you could comment at all on that question.
Because America is not very hospitable, I think for an emotional health is probably very useful to have both languages. For it's obviously such a much richer thing to be able to keep both, but not one for the sake of the other, right? So when I was teaching in Compton, I had students who didn't speak English at all, right? And I do think that the key is, if you're going to keep the language, you have to make them bilingual, right? Because sheltering them in the mother tongue, it does them a disservice, right? So you have to kind of balance between taking care of their emotional well-being, right, and making them able to participate and be able to represent themselves in public. It's a really hard place to strike, and I think one of the problems is because at its core, America is so monolingual, so stupidly monolingual. It can't quite understand. Most people don't speak a second language. They don't know how to balance that track, right? They don't even know also the kind of power it has for in many different ways. My colleague of mine at Harvard, Doris Sommer, wrote a book called Bilingual Games, right? And she talks often about what a great wealth of sort of cultural capital it is to know at least a second language. But because policymakers are often people who don't speak a second language, I think that's the problem, right? That they can't quite understand how to make it strike that balance publicly. Yeah.
Just a follow-up comment on that. It seems to me in your presentation that you seem to be giving an alternative language, if you like, in terms of a poetic language, in terms of sort of world literature, that's those linkages between Dante,
Naipaul.
Those references in terms of, so there's long sort of across centuries and across continents that even if people are monolingual, that they can connect across through sort of world literature in translation.
Yes.
My comment, but my question was in terms of a very different question, was the question of war, because when you were talking about figures in terms of El Salvador and so on, that I mean, those figures are astronomical. I mean, I worked as a translator at the War Crimes Tribunal for former Yugoslavia. I mean, when we talked about mass graves, I mean, that just meant more than one body.
Not 800 people.
Or say where my husband's hometown is from. I mean, you're talking about the number of deaths in terms of within the town itself. Just under 20. I mean, you're not. Whereas what you're saying is what we have is not recognised as a war. But in terms of what it looks like, in terms of comparisons on what have been recognised as wars and war crimes and so on, it looks much worse than certain civil wars or certain aspects of certain civil wars.
Yeah, no. And Rigoberta Menchu's testimonio, right? She's a Guatemalan indigenous figure. It's a complicated text. She dictated it to a Venezuelan anthropologist. But in that book, she talks about how Mayan women in villages in Guatemala have gone blind willfully because they've seen such horror. They just decide not to ever see again. And so I think that is powerful image to think about. If you witness 800 people being shot to death all at once, what kind of sense can you make out of the world? You know? It's horrifying.
But it's not war.
But it's not. Right. No, we're just going to send $10 million to help people put the kids right back where they are. You know, I think the political response has been atrocious.
I'm interested in the child immigrant.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking about the shift in terms of immigration policy, DREAMer, and how is that reflected at all in the literature, this idea, the real fear of deportation and the idea of coming out of the shadows and all of the artwork that's been produced as well to say, I exist.
Yeah.
Is this sort of connected in some way? Is there a shift in the literature, or has the child immigrant always been there in order to sort of narrate the trauma of immigration?
I think, you know, I had a student, one of my most gifted students at Harvard, had to come out as undocumented when she was about to graduate from Harvard because she couldn't work. Right? And so she ended up applying to a PhD program. She got in everywhere, and she ended up going to Yale. And in some ways, and she's also a creative writer, so she's written a piece called The Daily Beast that I can send to you. It's the account of how, of this coming out, you know. And I do think we're going to have to wait a little bit for that generation to write their narratives, you know. She's also a killer writer, so I think I can expect good things from her, you know. I think because it is in some ways very connected to things we've seen before in American culture, you know, the slave narrative. To put yourself out there, to declare yourself, is to be findable, to be traceable, right? And so I think that narrative is going to be shrouded in secrecy for a while, you know. You will have, you know, you have to really experiment with different art forms to be able to tell it, you know, in a way that doesn't trace you and get you deported. You know?
All right, good. And just before we finish up thanking Glenda, I've been given a slide by one of my PhD students to share with you, which is just letting you know about our next in our public series. Next Thursday at 6, Don Doyle, another international topic shared by James Brooks. Please do come to that. But please join me now in thanking Professor Carpio for visiting with us. Thank you very much.